Good day, everyone. This lecture replaces our class, which was originally scheduled for Tuesday, October the 1st. Today we will wrap up one idea from the September 26th class on melody before moving on to today's topic, counterpoint. On Thursday, we were discussing features of an effective melody. We looked at the climber, the stroll down the hill, and the third item we would like to look at today are melodies which have more complex contours. And so we're going to look at the motive and the idea of sequence. For our first example, let's look at the opening of Lutoslawski's Cello Concerto. Now here there are no long breathed melodic lines that strive for a goal or come quietly to rest on a tonic. Here everything is fragmentary. But now, if we look and listen closely, I think we can see and hear Lutoslawski's careful organization of the melodic material. Let's take a look at these two fragments. The two fragments are in different registers, and they begin on different notes, but you'll see that both follow the same general shape. If we look a little closer, we see that they also share some important melodic characteristics. We're in the bass clef, and if we look at this first fragment, we see that we descend from F to C, making a perfect fourth. We then move up to F sharp, that is an augmented fourth, then to B, that's another perfect fourth, and then up just a wee bit to a major second. If we look at the relationship between the notes in the second fragment, we see that they are identical. This time we begin on an F sharp, but we go down once again a perfect fourth, up an augmented fourth, up a perfect fourth, and then up a major second. When we have the same fragment begin here on two different pitch levels, we can begin to see that there is some sort of relationship between them. And indeed, we might start thinking of this not only as a melodic fragment, but a motive. And when we see one motive, this first fragment, repeated at a different pitch level, we say that it has been sequenced. A motive is a short musical idea. It could be melodic, harmonic, rhythmic, or any combination of these three. A motive may be of any size and is most commonly regarded as the shortest subdivision of a theme or phrase that still maintains its identity as an idea. It is most often thought of in melodic terms. So a motive is smaller than a phrase. As Drabkin suggests here, it's really the smallest unit that maintains an independent identity, just like that fragment of the Lutoslawski Cello Concerto. A sequence is, according to Percy Scholes, the more or less exact repetition of a melody at another level higher or lower. If the repetition is only in the melody with a changed harmony, it is called a melodic sequence. And if the repetition is followed also in the harmony, it's called a harmonic sequence. We'll look at harmonic sequences later in the course. Right now I'd like to focus on these melodic sequences, which is exactly what we have in the Lutoslawski piece. Let's go back to our two fragments and we'll look at the fragment that occurs immediately after this. Immediately after our opening two fragments, we have this third fragment here, which shares an important relationship with our opening motive. It is, in a way, another sequence, and a slightly developed sequence of the opening motive. So here we jump from an A to an E flat, so we go up a diminished fifth. That was equal to an augmented fourth, which was the second skip that we did. We then go up a perfect fourth, as we did before, and up a major second. And then we drop down a perfect fourth. This fragment is identical to the first two. However, all that we have different is that the first interval is moved to the end. So again, he seems to have sequenced one of the intervals over a little bit. However, we can see here that there's a very important, significant motivic relationship between these three opening fragments. Immediately after this, there are two more fragments. And again, these are little chunks, little motives that are then sequenced. So our first fragment, which you see on the left side of your screen, begins on a B natural, and then we do a little chromatic squiggling around before returning briefly to those low Ds. Here, we begin on that's a C sharp, because we're now in the tenor clef, and then once again we do a little chromatic squiggle. So we have pitches which share the same relationship to one another as the previous fragment, so it is motivic, and here it begins at a different pitch level, and so it is a melodic sequence. Here now let's look at another piece which makes use of motive and sequence. In many ways this is the sort of motivic piece par excellence, and this is Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. It begins with this motive, of course the very famous four-note da-da-da-dum. We begin moving from G to E flat, and then Beethoven sequences it down one step, F to D. He then repeats it and sequences it up, and then sequences it all over the place. So this entire piece is soaked with this motive, and Beethoven is able to achieve this kind of motivic coherence through the use of sequence. That is, repeating a motive on a variety of different pitch levels. This creates very intense and dense, but sort of thrilling musical texture that is, of course, for this particular piece, iconic. Now we can also observe sequences on melodic fragments that are longer than an individual motive. In fact, we can see them at the level of the phrase. We have an example of that here. This is the beginning of Mozart's Symphony number 40 in G minor, K550. Here we see that we open with an antecedent and a consequent phrase. Our antecedent phrase begins on and ends on in an incomplete way rather, on C, and our is a sequence of that. Mozart has moved it down just a half step. So we begin on a D and we end one step lower on a B flat. Since the piece is in G minor, this B flat ending feels stable. We have a sense of tonal closure here. And moreover, these two phrases have that balance that we see in an antecedent and a consequent. The fact that they follow the same pattern, that the consequent is a sequence of the antecedent, makes this melody all the more balanced and poised, and I think fantastic. Let's look at an identical example. This is Brahms's Academic Festival Overture. Once again, we have a consequent phrase which is a sequenced version of our antecedent phrase. So you can see here that the antecedent begins on C. If we follow all the notes along, we will notice that the consequent follows this pattern exactly. However, rather than beginning on a C, we begin on an E. Everything is or E flat rather, everything has been moved up 1/3. So therefore the consequent, again, a sequenced version of the antecedent. So to review, what makes an effective melody? I suggested that there were 3 things. The first is balance, and we achieve this through a number of ways. One of the most important, especially for music of the 18th and 19th centuries and popular music today, is an idea of an antecedent and a consequent phrase. An antecedent which poses a kind of question that needs to be resolved by the consequent. And as we saw today, sometimes the consequent can have an intimate relationship to the antecedent. And in this case, we do have beautiful balance in those instances in which we have sequence. We can also achieve a kind of balance through motivic unity. If we think to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, we can see that the fact that that one short 4-note motive permeates the entire musical fabric and achieves a kind of unity in its diversity of statements. A second important item, I think, for an effective melody is often closure. And this is the idea that we come to rest on a tonic, or at least a note which is in the tonic chord. That is the tonic, the third, or the fifth of the key of the piece. Also important is the sense, I think, that melodies follow some sort of satisfying pattern. This is related to the idea that there's an antecedent and a consequent, but also I think to our idea that there are certain archetypes of melodies, that is the climber or the stroll down the hill or whatever you want to call them, that we listen for and that we hear. And so we know when they're finished, it gives us that sense of closure that we expect. This is related to the third item, drama. And that is that they follow, in some ways, a kind of melodic narrative that we've already talked about. The climber or the stroll down the hill, or a variety of other, perhaps, variations on these 2 archetypes that I talked about. And then what we saw today is this sense of drama can also be achieved through a clever use of motive. Sometimes the concentration of motivic activity, as in the Beethoven example, creates a kind of intense drama all its own, even though we don't have these beautiful, long musical melodies that we can attach to. Let's move on now from thinking about individual melodies to thinking about the interaction of different musical lines. This is our subject for today. And the research question I would like to pose is this: how do melody and musical line interact to create effective counterpoint? I'm going to suggest that there are, again, 3 things that I think are important in effective counterpoint. Number 1 is contrast, number 2 is imitation, and number 3 is density. And I hope to convince you of this in the next little mini lecture here. The first question we would like to pose is, what is this thing called counterpoint? The word itself comes from the Latin contrapunctus, which means note against note. Counterpoint is defined by Arnold Whittle as the coherent combination of distinct melodic lines in music. Now, I think there are two ideas here that are important. The first of all is that there are distinct melodic lines in music. So we're talking about the interaction of different melodic musical lines. Now, the key word, though, is coherent. That is, even though that these lines may be distinct, there is an important relationship between them that makes sense. Let's explore this idea of a coherent relationship between musical lines by looking at Haydn's Emperor Quartet. This is Opus 76, number 3. We looked at the beginning already. Now let's look at the second movement, which features this really beautiful melody. Haydn had composed this melody a couple of years before he wrote the quartet for a gentleman named Francis II, who would eventually go on to be the Holy Roman Emperor. Subsequently, this theme sort of took on a life of its own. Haydn used it in his string quartet, and in the 19th century it was adopted as the German national anthem. And indeed, it still is today.
Die einen hochkonzentriert, die anderen, wie Müller zum Beispiel, extrem locker.
Haydn's tune is comprised of three distinct phrases. The first two follow, I think, a similar melodic archetype, and that is the climber, in which we sort of ascend at the opening phrase from E flat up to the fifth, B flat. In the second phrase, in which we ascend from F, and then up again to the B flat. And then in the last phrase, now having sort of strived and hit perhaps this high E flat, we descend, we take a stroll down the hill, as it were, down to a lower E flat. Haydn's setting of this hymn in his string quartet is much more solemn than the national anthem version that we just heard, but the pitch content is exactly the same. In the string quartet, Haydn subjects this particular tune to a number of variations, and each of these has a distinct contrapuntal identity. That is, the counterpoint is different in each one. Let's have a look at the first variation. We can see this in this example that there are two distinct musical lines. The first here in the second violin is our original hymn tune. In the first violin, we have this line of counterpoint, a second distinct melodic line. So we fulfill the first element of our definition. We have two distinct melodic lines. The second element was that there was some coherence between these individual melodic lines. Indeed, if we look at the individual note against note relationship, that is the counterpoint, contrapunctus, we see that between the second violin's G and the first violin's B, we have a major sixth. A major sixth, of course, sounds euphonious, it sounds consonant, it sounds lovely. And indeed, if we look at all of the other intervals, and indeed, if we look at the relationship between all of the other notes, we see that they all line up to form sixths or thirds of some kind, just as we would expect in consonant-sounding tonal music. So in other words, we have a coherent combination of sounds. Distinct melodic lines, coherent combination. Here is a great example of two-line counterpoint. Now, both of these lines are distinct such that they have basically nothing in common, and counterpoint of this type has a particular name. Free counterpoint is counterpoint in which each musical line is freely composed. Each musical line retains an independent identity, and this is certainly the case in our Haydn example. We have our solemn hymn tune, which marches steadily along. The first violin, however, plays this skippy, very disjunct line, which has a kind of skipping, energetic, frenetic quality to it, which contrasts quite beautifully with the sober melody beneath. Here in Variation 2, the hymn tune is now moved down from the second violin to the cello, and you can see it at the bottom there. The second violin now plays a new line, a new musical line of counterpoint, which in many ways mirrors, especially the rhythm, of the original tune. Violin 1 is no longer playing that skipping musical line. Instead, we get this more sober line, I suppose, which begins again in a very disjunct fashion, and then has this stepwise descent, this conjunct musical line that is syncopated. It has the effect of a kind of small child tugging on his mother's coattails. The viola plays really what is just sort of a little skeletal bit of a new contrapuntal line, as we can see there. It just has this little two-note jump. Let's now contrast free counterpoint with counterpoint of a different sort. We want to explore the idea of imitation. Imitation is the repetition, as Arnold Whitall says, which is a process more technical than aesthetic, of a motif or idea in other voices. So in the examples that we just looked at, free counterpoint involves melodies of distinct independent character. In imitation, each musical line, each voice involves some degree of imitation, of repetition. We see a clear example of this in the Bach piece. This is his fugue in A-flat major. Now, we already looked at the distinct musical lines that make up this opening. We see that we begin here with a first statement of our theme. We then get a number of other ones, a second, a third, and a fourth. Each time the theme comes in, it introduces a new musical line, a new line of counterpoint into our musical fabric. And this is an example of what we call imitative counterpoint. imitative counterpoint is counterpoint in which each musical line imitates another, especially when it first enters. So we can contrast this with free counterpoint, in which we have distinct lines. So free counterpoint and imitative counterpoint both involve more than one musical line which shares a coherent relationship. In imitative counterpoint, however, they share the additional relationship of melodic or motivic content between these individual musical lines. We see imitative counterpoint occur within a piece as well. This is Brahms's Academic Festival Overture, and the point at which the brass enter with this, again, hymn-like melody. So first, we open with the trumpets, which has this ascent up into this chord. What we'll notice is that each time a new instrument enters, that is, each time Brahms adds a new musical line, there is always this leap up. Each entry of the line imitates a previous one. We have counterpoint. It creates for us a very stirring effect, I think, the slow building of the texture through this use of imitative counterpoint. In cases like the Bach piece, we see that there is additionally an imitative relationship between those other musical lines that we already looked at. So that chromatic theme that we looked at, which you see here in blue, is imitated again when it is reintroduced up top. This is in the second system. And again, if we were to continue looking at the piece throughout, we would see that our example in red here of our fast-moving musical line is imitated in other voices as well. When we have a very dense level of imitation, we often refer to this kind of musical texture as fugal. And in cases in which this is the entire piece, we refer to it as a fugue. A fugue is a composition in which three or more voices, that is, musical lines, enter imitatively one after the other, each giving chase to the preceding voice. Fugue is a style of composition rather than a fixed structure. So fugues come in a variety of forms. Fugues, they come from the Latin verb fugare, which means to chase. And we get the sense that each time a new musical line enters, it chases, literally, the other one. When we have very dense imitative counterpoint, we often have this kind of fugal texture. And we see this not only in pure fugues, like the Bach piece we just looked at, but also within larger works as well. When a fugal procedure is inserted into a larger composition, we often refer to this moment, this fugal procedure, as a fugato. We often call it, this is the Oxford Dictionary of Music, a passage in fugal style introduced into a non-fugal composition. So again, we have dense imitative counterpoint, but here it's within the context of a larger piece. Let's listen to the third movement now of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. I won't put the score on the image here, but you can follow along with it on your PDF files. Here we have, you'll notice, an opening theme, motive if you will, which is then repeated on a variety of different levels in different instruments. It is, in other words, a fugal texture. Let's have a listen. The last item that I want to look at, in addition to contrast and imitation, is density. And to look at this, we'll look once again at our Haydn Emperor Quartet, the second movement that had that lovely Emperor's Hymn, which is now the German national anthem, as we suggested. Variation 1, as we saw, was very sparse. We only have 2 lines of free counterpoint. Variation 2 has more activity. In addition to the theme and the second violin, we have a new line of counterpoint in the first violin, a very skeletal, just little leap there in the viola, and then a complementary line in the cello that follows our theme quite closely. So here, this is a more dense contrapuntal texture. We have not 2 lines, but really sort of 3 occurring, and perhaps a little 0.5% perhaps of another line in the viola. So here, Haydn thickens the texture a bit. He increases the contrapuntal density. Variation 3, again, features 3 lines of counterpoint, free counterpoint. And here we have an almost sort of imitative texture. So the first violin plays something reminiscent of actually the theme that we just heard. The second violin enters with this long sort of leaping figure, which is again reminiscent of something we saw in the previous variation. So here we have a very active contrapuntal texture, but it's not thick, or rather it's not as thick as it could be, because our cello, as we can see, is not yet participating. Leave it to variation 4 to have much more activity going on. We'll notice here, though, that most of the notes move at relatively the same rate. So these lines are less distinct than they might otherwise be. So here we have a nice example of counterpoint that creates a sort of sense of solemnness, right? Because we don't have a lot of activity seemingly going on. We have a nice, full, beautiful texture. Here in the very last measures of the second movement, we see an example of the ways in which density can play a role in shaping the musical drama. It's one of the most spectacular moments of the entire piece. Now, we're going for one last repeat of that last frame, that last stroll down the hill, in which we move, here's the theme in the first violin, from our G in a lovely descent down. Now, to achieve a kind of sense of drama here as we draw to a close, Haydn first of all strips away all of the texture. And we just have one musical line, this violin, which ascends to its very highest part of its range. Then each instrument enters separately with a different contrapuntal line, though the viola and the cello both share some material here. They're playing in thirds. So what Haydn has done is he's increased the contrapuntal density here. Even though the context is sort of very quiet and subdued, we have very chromatic and active contrapuntal texture. And then, in the very last moments of the piece, Haydn gets very dramatic. The cello stops playing a contrapuntal role and plays this long G pedal. First violin finishes out the tune as it descends lovely down. Our second violin and viola play 2 lines of counterpoint that eventually peter out in these last 3 notes as the quartet all sounds together before playing one last cadence and one last hushed whole note. It brings things to a dramatic close, and it is achieved through the manipulation of the contrapuntal density. Let's review the terms that we looked at today. We were exploring the idea of counterpoint, and we contrasted two different versions of counterpoint: free, in which their melodic lines are distinct, and imitative, in which each line imitates the previous one. We have a definition for imitation, and we looked at those works which have a very dense amount of imitation, which often we call a fugue, and if a short fugue rather occurs in the context of a larger piece, we have a fugato. So hopefully today we've seen the way that counterpoint can create unity out of variety. So even though we have a number of distinct musical lines occurring, there is a coherent relationship between them. And this coherent relationship brings a unity to the piece. It makes the piece make sense. And out of this variety, we have this unity, which is always an extraordinary feat. We also saw the way in which imitative textures can enliven the musical fabric. Think of the Brahms example. We have this very slow-moving, long, hymn-like tune. Now, Brahms creates a little bit more drama by creating an imitative texture alongside these sort of solemn entries. And the last thing we looked at is the idea that composers can change the density of the counterpoint in order to create musical interest and drama. And we can see this in a variety of pieces, but I think quite clearly in the end of the second movement of Haydn's Emperor Concerto. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. I'll look forward to returning to class in person and seeing you all soon. I hope you're all well. Take care, and I'll see you soon.